The knife wasn't meant for a man. It was meant for roots, for stripping bark, for the simple work of a woman's hands. But in the firelight, slick with grease and malice, it found a new purpose. It found its way into the soft part of a man's neck. One moment, Corin was breathing stale corn beer all over her, his weight a crushing final thing. The next, he was on the ground, a surprised look in his eyes, his life spilling out into the dust. He was dead, and she was alive. But sometimes surviving is the worst kind of betrayal. The memory was a hot brand on Tyoma's skin. It started with Corin's laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together. He was an elder warrior, a man respected, a man twice her age with a wife and children, and he had backed her against the woodpile, his eyes glazed over, not seeing her, only seeing a thing he wanted to take. His hand, calloused and cruel, had fumbled with the ties of her deerskin dress. She fought, she screamed, but no one came. In the tribe, a warrior's word was law, and a young woman's fear was just noise. Desperation is a kind of strength. Her fingers, scrabbling in the dirt, found the handle of that forgotten flint knife. It was small, almost a toy, but it was sharp. She didn't think. She just lunged, a frantic, wild motion. The knife went in deep. Corin stumbled back, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. He clutched his neck, then fell like a great, felled tree. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. The wails that rose into the night weren't for her. They were for him. Her people, her own kin, gathered around, their faces hard as stone in the flickering light of the fire. They saw a dead warrior. They saw a wild girl with blood on her hands. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a murderer. The council met under the old oak, their judgment already decided. Her plea of self-defense was a child's story, a lie to cover a dark sin. Corin was a provider. She was just a girl. The verdict was swift. Death by morning. That night her mother came to her. Her face was a mask of grief, but her eyes were urgent, burning. "They will not spare you," she whispered, her voice raw. "Their hearts are stone. They have chosen him, chosen the old ways. You are condemned. Run, Tyoma, run and never look back. Live." Her mother pressed a small pouch into her hand. Dried meat, a fire starter, a ticket to a life she never wanted. And so Tyoma ran. She ran from the only home she had ever known, the faces of her people turning from family to executioners in the space of a single heartbeat. Each step was a prayer. Each ragged breath was a curse on Corin's name. The sky opened up, a furious storm that matched the one in her soul, lashing at her, soaking her, trying to drag her back. She ran until her lungs were on fire, until her legs were numb, until the familiar trees and rocks of her home blurred into a nightmare landscape of mud and shadow. She ran west. There was a rumor, a whisper passed between women when the men weren't listening. A story of a solitary white man, a rancher named Merrick, whose land was so vast and so isolated it was like its own country, a place where a person could disappear. Hours later, half drowned and shaking, she saw it. A faint light, a tiny spark of hope in the black, swirling rain. It grew closer, resolving itself into a house, a massive house, bigger than any 10 of her tribe's lodges put together, with sturdy barns and fences that marched off into the gloom. This was it, the ranch of August Merrick, a man said to be as cold and hard as the granite peaks that watched over his land. A widower, they whispered, who had buried his heart with his wife years ago, a man who had everything, but felt nothing. She stumbled onto the porch, her body a single screaming ache. Her hand trembled as she raised it to knock. The wood was solid, real. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a bolt scraped back and the door creaked open. He stood there, a giant framed in the warm lamplight. tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it was carved from a cliffside. His eyes, even in the shadows, were sharp, piercing. They took in her soaked clothes, her matted hair, her trembling body. A flicker of surprise, quickly hidden, crossed his face. Her pride was a thing of the past, a luxury she could no longer afford. It shattered on the wet porch boards as she fell to her knees. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't feel it. She fixed her eyes on his heavy leather boots. "Please," she choked out, the word raw and broken. "I beg you." Her gaze lifted, meeting his. It was the last gamble of a desperate soul. "Let me stay. I'll do whatever you want. I can clean, I can cook. You can use me, however you wish. I can even give you an heir, if that is your will." The words hung in the rain-soaked air, shocking in their naked desperation. August Merrick's face remained a mask of stone. He looked down at the native girl kneeling at his feet, offering the last thing she had left to give. His housekeeper, Martha, had left a week ago. Family emergency. The house was falling into disarray. The work was piling up. Finding help this far out was a fool's errand, and now the storm had brought this solution to his doorstep. It was practical. It was temporary. It was a problem solved. He let the silence stretch, watching the hope flicker and die in her eyes. Then he spoke, his voice low and flat, devoid of any warmth. "Get up." He didn't offer a hand. He just commanded, "You're soaked to the bone." He stepped back, a silent invitation into the warmth of the house. The heat was a shock, a bliss so sudden it almost buckled her knees. "You can stay," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't an act of kindness, "until the storm breaks. Then we will discuss what happens next. Do you understand?" Tioma could only nod, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She was inside. She was safe. For now. But the coldness in his eyes promised a different kind of storm, and she had no idea if she would be able to survive that one either. She followed him into the house, a ghost in a world she didn't understand, her future tethered to the whims of a man with a frozen heart. The first light of dawn crept into the ranch house like a thief, revealing a kingdom of dust. For 4 years since his wife Clara's death, August Merrick's home had been a tomb, a place where memories were preserved under a thick blanket of neglect, a perfect mirror for the man's own soul. Tioma moved through the quiet rooms like a phantom, her presence so slight it barely disturbed the stale air. August had made the rules clear without saying much at all. She was temporary, an inconvenience he would tolerate for a short time. He gave her a small spare room at the back of the house, a simple cot, and the unspoken promise that she would be gone as soon as the rain stopped. There was no welcome, no kindness. He saw her as a tool, a temporary fix for his domestic problems. "Do what you need to do," he had grunted, gesturing vaguely at the mess before vanishing into his study, the door closing with a heavy finality. He expected her to be invisible, unheard. But silence has a way of making you notice small sounds. The first few days, Tioma worked from sunup to sundown. August, used to the groans and sighs of an empty house, found himself listening. The soft swish of a broom, the quiet clatter of a bucket, the gentle splash of water against a grimy window pane. He'd catch glimpses of her as he passed a doorway, a flash of her dark braid as she scrubbed a floorboard, the determined set of her shoulders as she wrestled with a heavy rug. He told himself it was just a practical assessment. He was a businessman, after all, and she was an employee. Slowly, the house began to change. The layers of dust began to yield. Sunlight, which had struggled through filthy windows, now streamed in, bright and clear, illuminating the faded, forgotten beauty of the rooms. The parlor, which had been a shrine to Clara's memory, a place he never entered, started to feel less like a graveyard. It was still quiet, but it wasn't dead anymore. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but the air in the house felt lighter, less suffocating. One afternoon, he walked to the stables and stopped dead. He saw her with the horses. There was one young mare, a skittish thing that shied away from everyone, even him. Tioma was standing beside her, speaking in a low, murmuring tone in her own language. Her hand was stroking the mare's neck, and the horse, instead of flinching, was leaning into the touch, its eyes soft and calm. August watched from the shadows of the stable door, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. He'd spent his whole life with horses, breaking the wildest spirits, but he'd never seen anything like this. An instant, silent understanding. He saw the quiet competence in everything she did, the way she patched a torn saddle blanket with neat, efficient stitches, the way she moved among the powerful animals with a grace that soothed them. She had a strength that had nothing to do with size or muscle. It was a deep, quiet resilience. But the biggest change was in the kitchen. For 4 years, his meals had been an afterthought: cold beef, hard bread, eaten standing up. The great iron stove, once the heart of the home, had been cold for years. On the third evening, a smell hit him as he walked in from the fields. Wood smoke, yes, but something else. Something rich, something that made his stomach rumble. He followed the scent to the kitchen and found her there, stirring a large pot over a crackling fire. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes meeting his for a second before she quickly looked away. That night he sat at his own table and ate a hot meal, a simple beef stew with fresh bread she had somehow baked. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. It wasn't just the food, it was the warmth. It was the feeling of being cared for, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. His observations started to shift. He was no longer just assessing her work. He found himself watching her. He noticed the way the firelight caught the high curve of her cheekbone, the way her dark hair gleamed, the quiet intensity in her eyes when she focused on a task. He saw her strength not just in her work, but in her silence. She never complained. She never asked for anything. She simply endured, and in her endurance she was transforming his world. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft rustle of her movements, the gentle rhythm of her presence. And then it deepened. He wasn't just seeing her strength anymore. He was seeing her. He saw the effortless grace in the way she moved. He saw a stark, wild beauty in her face, a beauty that was rooted in her spirit, in the quiet dignity that surrounded her like a cloak. And a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in the frozen depths of his chest. It was a warmth he hadn't felt in a decade. It was comfort. It was hope. It was desire. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a shocking awakening in a heart he thought had turned to stone long ago. He started replaying small moments in his mind. The way her fingers had accidentally brushed his when she handed him a plate. The ghost of a smile on her lips when she thought he wasn't looking. The steady, unwavering strength in her gaze. He had buried those feelings with Clara. He had sworn they would never touch him again, but Tioma's quiet presence was like a spring thaw, unearthing them one painful, hesitant heartbeat at a time. That evening he stood on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and blood. The day's work was done. The house behind him was warm and clean. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Tioma was in her room, a quiet presence at the other end of the house. He had assumed she would be gone by now, a fleeting problem that had solved itself. But she was still here. She had taken root in the barren landscape of his life, and the thought of her leaving, which had once been a certainty, now landed on him with a crushing weight. The ranch was changing. He was changing. He was no longer just watching a temporary employee. He was seeing a woman. And in seeing her, he was starting to see the possibility of a life he thought was gone forever. But as he stood there, a flicker of movement on the distant ridge caught his eye. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a lone rider sitting motionless on a horse, watching the ranch. Just watching. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The storm had passed, but he had a terrible feeling that the real trouble was just beginning. The house, once a silent tomb, now had a rhythm. It was the rhythm of Tioma's soft footsteps on the wooden floors, the whisper of her voice as she sometimes sang to herself while she worked, the scent of the wild herbs she gathered and used in her cooking. The distance between them began to shrink, melting away like snow in the spring sun. August found himself making excuses to be near her. He would show her how to mend a fence, and find himself watching the way the sun lit up her dark hair instead of the fence post. He would explain the cycles of planting and get lost in the genuine curiosity in her eyes. He started talking, really talking, for the first time in years. He told her about the cattle, about the land, about the endless struggle for rain, things he hadn't shared with a soul since Clara. And Tioma, in turn, listened with an intensity that made him feel seen. She seemed to find a strange comfort in his quiet, steady presence, in the unspoken protection he offered. A look held a second too long across the dinner table, an accidental brush of hands as they reached for the same tool. The air in every room they shared crackled with unspoken tension. The nights were the worst, or the best. The heat from the fireplace seemed to magnify the heat that was building between them. One evening they sat on the porch, the sky a blanket of stars. He saw her shiver in the cool night air. Without thinking, he stood, went inside, and came back with a heavy wool blanket. As he draped it around her shoulders, his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her arm. It was a brief touch, but a jolt of lightning shot through both of them. It was a point of no return. After that, the pretense fell away. A stolen kiss in the shadows of the kitchen, a touch that lingered on her waist as they passed in the narrow hallway. The slow, deliberate crumbling of the walls he had spent years building around his heart. They became lovers. In the quiet darkness of his room, they found a comfort and a passion that was as wild and untamed as the land around them. It was tender and it was fierce, a desperate collision of two lonely souls. But even in those moments, a thorn of doubt pricked at August's heart. He had given her shelter. She had offered her body in return. He couldn't shake the fear that she was with him not out of desire, but out of a sense of obligation, a debt being repaid. While a fragile peace settled over the ranch, the nearby town was a hive of whispers. News travels fast in small places, and the story of the reclusive August Merrick taking in a young native woman spread like wildfire. He's finally lost his mind, they'd say in the general store. A savage in Clara's house. What would she think? The gossip was vicious, fueled by fear and prejudice. August's reputation, once shielded by his wealth, was now being torn to shreds. The tension finally snapped on a bright, sunny afternoon. A fine carriage pulled up in front of the house. August was in the barn, but he saw who it was immediately. The elegant, rigid figure of Callie, his late wife's sister. Her lips were a thin, hard line. Her eyes, so much like Clara's, were burning with a cold fire. Tioma was near the house, gathering firewood. She saw the carriage, saw the woman's furious expression, and a chill went down her spine. She quickly stepped back, hiding herself behind a large bush, her heart pounding. She watched as August walked out to meet the woman. "August, what in God's name is going on?" Callie's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet afternoon air. "I heard the rumors, but I refuse to believe them. A native girl. In this house? Have you completely lost your mind?" August's face hardened. "Callie, this is none of your business. She needed help." "Help?" Callie scoffed, her laugh like breaking glass. "August, people are saying you're keeping her as your whore. You're dragging Clara's good name through the mud." Her voice rose, filled with a righteous fury. "She is a threat to everything decent, August. She represents barbarism, savagery. She has no place in this home, the home that Clara loved. Each word was a poisoned dart. You need to get rid of her, send her away, for your own good, for Clara's memory. Hidden behind the bush, Tioma felt every word like a physical blow. Savage, barbarism, no place here. The truth of her situation crashed down on her. She wasn't a refugee finding sanctuary. She was a scandal, a stain on this man's life. She backed away silently, the cruel words echoing in her head. She ran to her small room, her hands shaking. The hope she had allowed to bloom in her heart withered and died. She was nothing but a burden. Outside, August stood frozen, long after Callie's carriage had disappeared in a cloud of dust. He felt the weight of her words, the truth of the town's judgment. But underneath it, a fierce, protective anger was rising. An urge to shield Tioma from the hatred of the world, from people like Callie. But he also knew Callie was right about one thing. This couldn't last. Sooner or later, the outside world would come crashing in. He was trapped between the life he was starting to build with Tioma and the memory of the life he had lost. And the ground between those two worlds was starting to crumble beneath his feet. He turned and walked back toward the house, a grim decision forming in his mind. But when he opened the door, he found the main room empty. Tioma was gone, and on the table where his dinner plate usually sat was the small, carved bird she had made, a farewell gift. He wasn't just losing her. She had already left. The panic that seized him was cold and absolute. He ran to her room. It was empty. The cot was neatly made. She was truly gone. He burst out of the house, scanning the vast, empty landscape. He saw her, a small, solitary figure already far in the distance, walking away from the ranch, heading back into the wilderness she had fled. He didn't even think. He ran to the stables, saddled his fastest horse, and galloped after her. The thundering of the hooves was a frantic drumbeat matching the panic in his heart. He caught up to her in a shallow ravine, her figure small and defeated against the towering rock walls. He leaped from his horse, his boots sliding in the loose gravel. "Tioma!" She turned, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were resolute. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I bring you nothing but trouble. I am a ghost that haunts your house. It is better this way." "No," he said, his voice raw. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "You are not a ghost. You are the only thing in this house that is alive." The words poured out of him, the truth he had been hiding even from himself. "Don't you see? Before you came, I was the ghost. That house was a tomb. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life." He stopped, breathing heavily, his heart laid bare. "Stay, please, stay with me." Her resolve began to crumble. She looked at this hard, cold man, now broken and pleading before her. She saw not the master of the ranch, but a man as lost and lonely as she was. But before she could answer, a sound made them both freeze. A low, guttural cry from the ridge above them. They looked up. Standing there, silhouetted against the setting sun, were three riders. They were warriors from her tribe, and in the lead was Cale, Corin's brother. His face was painted for war, and in his hand he held a long, sharp spear. He wasn't there to watch. He was there to claim the blood debt. Tioma's life for his brothers. The fragile hope of the last few moments shattered into a million pieces. There was nowhere left to run. Cale's eyes were like chips of obsidian, fixed on Tioma. August instinctively moved to stand in front of her, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. The two other warriors fanned out, their movements fluid and predatory, effectively cutting off any escape. "The woman is ours," Kyle said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet ravine. "She took the life of my brother. Our law demands justice." "Your brother attacked her," August said, his voice a low growl. She defended herself. That's a law any man can understand. A bitter smile twisted Kyle's lips. He was a warrior of the people. She is nothing. Give her to us, white man, and you can walk away. This is not your fight. August didn't flinch. She is under my protection. You want her. You come through me. It was a reckless, suicidal declaration. One man with a pistol against 3 warriors armed with spears and bows. But in that moment, August knew he would rather die there in the dirt than let them take her. He was done running from life. He was done letting the things he cared about be taken from him. Cale raised his spear. This was it, the final, bloody end. Tioma closed her eyes, a silent prayer on her lips. But just as Cale was about to give the signal to attack, another voice echoed through the ravine, a lazy, chilling drawl. "Well, now, looks like we're interrupting a party." Everyone froze. On the opposite ridge, another group of riders had appeared, 6 of them. They were white men, hard-faced and dusty, their clothes ragged, their guns worn but well-oiled. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with a cruel smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He wore a dusty black coat, and August recognized him instantly. A cold dread, colder than any fear he had ever known, washed over him. It was Silas Kane, an outlaw, a murderer, a man August had sent to prison 15 years ago, back when he wore a marshal's badge, a man who had sworn a blood oath to see August dead. "Merrick," Silas Kane drawled, tipping his hat. "I heard you'd gone soft, retired to this little patch of heaven, heard you'd even found yourself some company." His eyes lingered on Tioma, a greasy, predatory look that made August's blood run cold. "My friends and I were just passing through. Thought we'd pay you a visit. Collect on an old debt." Silas's gaze shifted to Kyle and his warriors. "As for you boys, I suggest you move along. This is a private reunion." The situation had gone from impossible to apocalyptic. They were trapped, pinned between 2 groups of enemies, each wanting them dead for different reasons. Kyle looked from Silas's gang to August, his face a mask of confusion and fury. His personal quest for vengeance had just been hijacked by a bigger, uglier conflict. He had come for justice, not to be caught in the crossfire of a white man's war. "What is this?" Kyle demanded, his spear still pointed at August. "My past," August said grimly. "Looks like it finally caught up with me." Silas Kane laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "It always does, Marshal." He raised his rifle. "Now, I'm only going to say this once. Give me the girl and all the gold you've got stashed in that big house of yours, and I might let you die quick. Otherwise, we're going to have some fun." Suddenly, Kyle made a decision. He let out a sharp, piercing cry, a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls. But it wasn't a cry of attack against August. He turned, and in one smooth motion, hurled his spear. It flew through the air, a deadly arc of wood and stone, and buried itself in the chest of one of Silas's men, knocking him clean off his horse. The truce, if there ever was one, was over. The ravine exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from Silas's gang. The other 2 warriors with Coil let arrows fly, silent, deadly messengers that found their marks. August drew his Colt, firing with a speed and accuracy he hadn't used in years, the muscle memory of 1,000 gunfights coming back to him in a rush. He shoved Tioma behind a large boulder. "Stay down!" he yelled over the din of the battle. It was a whirlwind of violence, a desperate 3-way war in a rocky grave. Silas's men were caught by surprise, expecting a simple robbery, not a fight with hardened native warriors and a retired lawman who was anything but soft. But there were too many of them. One of Cale's warriors went down, an arrow in his back from a flanking outlaw. Then the other fell, a rifle slug tearing through his chest. Now it was just August and Cale, back to back, fighting a losing battle. Silas, staying out of the direct fray, raised his rifle and took careful aim at August. He saw his shot. The world seemed to slow down. Tioma, peeking from behind the rock, saw it too. Silas's finger tightening on the trigger. She didn't have a weapon. She had nothing. But she wasn't the same girl who had run from her tribe. She had found something to fight for. Without a second thought, she broke cover. She ran, not away, but directly at Silas Kane's horse, screaming a wordless cry of fury. Her sudden appearance startled the horse. It reared up, whinnying in panic, just as Silas fired. The shot went wild, ricocheting off the canyon wall. Silas cursed, fighting to control his mount. That single moment was all August needed. He turned and fired twice. Two shots so close together they sounded like one. Both hit Silas Kane square in the chest. The outlaw's eyes went wide with shock, and he toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, galloping away as fast as their horses could carry them. The silence that fell over the ravine was sudden and profound, broken only by the groaning of a wounded man and the stamping of a nervous horse. It was over. August stood breathing heavily, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. Tioma was frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Kyle leaned on his spear, a deep gash bleeding on his arm, looking at the carnage around them. He walked over to August, his face grim. He looked at the bodies of his fallen warriors, then at Tioma, who was now standing beside August. The fire of vengeance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary understanding. "You fought for her," he said, his voice quiet. "It wasn't a question." "I did," August replied. Cale nodded slowly. "My brother was a fool. He was driven by pride and drink. The elders, they knew this. But the law is the law." He looked at Tioma, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than hatred in his eyes. "You have paid the blood debt. The spirits of my warriors who died here today have paid it. You are an outcast no longer. You are free." He turned without another word, whistled for his horse, and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing back into the land he had come from. August and Tioma were left alone, standing in the middle of a battlefield that had almost been their grave. The sun was setting, bathing the scene in a soft, golden light that seemed to mock the violence that had just occurred. He walked over to her, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak. She looked at him, at this man who had been a stranger just weeks ago, this cold, broken man who had just stood against two armies for her. In his eyes she saw not a master, not a protector, but a partner, an equal. "You came back for me," she whispered. "I'll always come back for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But their relief was short-lived. As they stood there, a new sound reached them. The sound of a carriage approaching at a frantic pace. They turned to see Callie's carriage racing toward them, kicking up a cloud of dust. But she wasn't alone. Riding beside her was the town sheriff and two of his deputies, all of them with rifles drawn. Callie's face was a mask of triumph. She had seen the outlaws ride toward the ranch. She had seen her plan unfolding perfectly. She had brought the law to witness the final act, to find August dead, and the savage girl having killed him after a robbery gone wrong. She would be the grieving sister-in-law, the sole heir to the Merrick fortune. Her triumphant expression froze as she took in the scene. The dead outlaws, the missing native warriors, and August and Tioma, standing there alive. Her plan was in ruins. Her mind raced, desperately trying to salvage the situation. "Sheriff!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Tioma. "There she is, the savage. She was in league with these outlaws. They killed Mr. Merrick's men. She was trying to rob him. Arrest her." The sheriff, a man named Brody who had always disliked August, looked from Callie's frantic face to the calm, steady gaze of the former lawman. He saw the dead bodies, the evidence of a fierce battle. He saw the way August stood protectively beside the native woman. Something wasn't right. "What happened here, Merrick?" Brody asked, his eyes narrowed. Before August could speak, Tyoma took a step forward. All her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She looked directly at Callie. "She is the one," Tyoma said, her voice clear and strong. "She is the one who brought them here. I heard her in town, whispering to the one called Silas. I saw her give him a map. It was a lie, a brilliant, calculated lie. She hadn't been in town, but she had seen the look on Callie's face, and she knew, with the instinct of a survivor, that this woman was the source of all the poison." Callie's face went white. "She's lying, a filthy, savage liar. Sheriff, are you going to believe her over me? A respectable woman?" "Actually," August said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think I am." He looked at Sheriff Brody. "Silas Kane was an old enemy of mine. He wouldn't have known I was here. He wouldn't have known about my financial situation. Not unless someone told him. Someone who stood to gain if I was dead." He let his gaze drift pointedly to Callie. The sheriff looked at Callie, whose panic was now clearly visible. Her story was falling apart. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape. And then she made her final, fatal mistake. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, silver derringer. But she didn't aim it at August or Tyoma. She aimed it at her own head. "You won't take me," she hissed, her eyes wild. "This ranch belonged to my sister. It's mine by right." "Callie, no!" August yelled, taking a step forward. But it was too late. The small gun barked, a pathetic pop in the vast silence of the ravine. Callie crumpled to the ground, the final victim of her own greed and hatred. The sheriff and his deputies could only stare in stunned silence. The whole twisted story was laid bare in that one desperate act. In the aftermath, as the bodies were being collected and the story was being pieced together, Sheriff Brody walked over to August. He looked at Tyoma with a newfound respect. "Looks like you found yourself a good woman, Merrick," he said, a grudging admiration in his voice. "A fighter." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them in peace. They returned to the ranch as the last light of day faded. The house stood waiting for them, no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary, a home forged in violence and loss, but a home nonetheless. That night they didn't speak of what had happened. There were no words big enough. They simply held each other, finding in their shared warmth a promise of a future they had almost died for, a future that was finally, truly theirs. They had faced down their pasts, their enemies, and the judgment of the world, and they had won. Standing on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, August pulled her close. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with peace. This story, born from the harsh realities of the Old West, makes you wonder about the true meaning of home and justice. Was it the law of Tioma's tribe, or the law of the sheriff's badge? Or did they forge their own kind of justice in that bloody ravine? What do you think defines a person's right to be safe and to belong? Is it the blood you're born with, or the bonds you forge in the fire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories where the lines are blurred and survival means rewriting all the rules, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.